So a couple of months ago, I was sitting on my mother-in-law's couch, and she was watching Merlin, and I thought, why not? We need something new. We'll try it out, see how it is. And we watched all of it. And this show just comprehensively broke my heart. Let me explain. So, The Adventures of Merlin is a King Arthur retelling, and like any avid fantasy reader, I was somewhat familiar with what happens. Sword in the Stone, Lady in the Lake, Once and Future King, so on and so forth. I also knew that the legends vary quite a bit, and there are different versions of the tale in French and in English. So in watching the show, I knew that they'd made a lot of deviations from what is considered canonical mythology, and the first big change I want to talk about is tone. I don't know if you've read the Arthurian legends, but they're dark. Like rape, incest, patricide, that sort of thing. The story most people are familiar with is the tragedy of Guinevere and Lancelot, wherein Arthur's bestie and wife betray him and run away together, and this ultimately causes a civil war that topples Arthur's kingdom. That, however, is pretty tame compared to some of the other stories. So when you look at the comparable warmth and humor in Merlin, you do see a big shift in tone from the original stories. Some of the darker themes do bleed through, but for the most part, characters don't really reflect the comparable darkness in the original mythology. For example, in the folklore, Arthur is actually the product of rape. But although Uther in the show is definitely an antagonistic character, he isn't straight up evil. He's more morally complicated than being a straightforward villain, right? In the show, for the most part, Uther is lawful evil. Like, he loves his son and to an extent his daughter, and he has his own moral code, although he doesn't always follow it. In the show, Uther is a very different man than in the legends, although in both cases he exploits magic to achieve his ends. Now, I think this tone shift is actually pretty good for the show they wanted to make. A show as frankly depraved as the Arthurian legends is more Game of Thrones than BBC pre-Watershed Hour programming. This departure from the text allows the show to have a more heartwarming, hopeful vibe and be funny. But this tone shift actually figures into what went so wrong with the ending of the show, so we'll circle back to this. Before I talk about the big problems, I'm going to talk about what I really liked about the show. However, it is these high points that make the rough parts of the show so devastating, because we can see the potential the show has and how good it can be. It's kind of an I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed in you, except that I am mad and I will die angry. The cast is nearly flawless and almost all perfect in their roles. I love everybody and they all have excellent chemistry, with one notable exception that I will address later. Some of the best scenes in the show are between Gaius and Merlin, Merlin and Arthur, and Morgana and anybody. The casting is phenomenal, and Anthony Stewart Head in particular is really excellent in this role. I swear, part of the reason the show is so good is because of how well the cast works together. There's a reason that a lot of fans will post compilations even now, years after the show stopped airing. The writing is also pretty consistently good through the run of the show, and also quite funny. The main source of humor for the show is its farcical nature. Merlin is the most powerful magical being in existence, and he has to hide his nature and do menial chores for the prince, in a land where magic is banned. Objectively, that's an excellent and humorous premise. And the actors are all very gifted at carrying off the lines, even the more ridiculous ones. The lore is also great. I love the additions of Merlin's heritage and the lore about dragons. It really adds to the magical nature of the show and makes the whole world feel very fleshed out. So that's pretty much it, the good stuff. Unfortunately, it is a very good basis for a show, which again is what makes the payoff so disappointing. Now let's talk about the problems. Gwen is poorly rendered in the show in two different ways. One is in her portrayal and the other is in the writing of the character. Gwen stands out as a poorly cast character, mostly due to the lack of chemistry with her co-stars, which is only notable because her other co-stars gel together so well, and just because of her noticeable blandness. Gwen is written as the girl next door, right? And while that works for the first season or two, when she's supposed to be the great love of Arthur's life, she really doesn't get fleshed out anymore. I also think that Gwen is a serious victim of bad writing because she really does get so little to work with in the show. She has very little agency. She isn't really a proactive character, and we know so little about her. She's loyal, she loves her family, and she is both clever and industrious, but other than saying, "I'm the blacksmith's daughter," 6 or 7 times in the first season, we really don't know that much about her. We get very little measure of her personality, her hopes and dreams, her desires. She isn't the main character of the show, but they really do her very dirty, especially with the Lancelot storyline. And again, it doesn't help that in a cast that has such good chemistry, Gwen doesn't really vibe well with anybody else. I'm not saying the actress is untalented, but the show really does not give us any idea of her abilities. Morgana is a wonderful addition to the show, which is definitely partially down to the actress, who does an amazing job in this role. She really works well with the material they gave her, but at a certain point that material totally falls flat. Morgana in the first few seasons really questions the authority of her guardian and disobeys him to do what she thinks is right. She discovers that she has magic and has a lot of conflict about that. And then she goes on a year-long walkabout and descends into mindless hatred for the people who raised her and everything they hold dear. This heel turn could have been earned if we'd seen it at all, seen any progression, but the writers basically took her off screen, clapped their hands, and said, she's evil now, so mote it be. The lack of any transition essentially turns Morgana into a mustache-twirling villain with no compelling motive or story. She wants to revenge herself on the father who rejected her, and then what? She wants to dethrone her brother, but why? He loves her, they grew up together, and she never even gives him a chance to accept her as a sister. Morgana's actions cease to make sense from this point. We could have seen her slowly be poisoned toward her father by her sister, or become a zealot against Uther in her own right, but that would have been too complex and meaningful, I guess. Morgana is the prototypical at-risk youth. She desperately wants attention and desires love and affection, but she is denied that by her father. This is apparently enough to turn her to the dark side, despite the fact that she has a loyal friend and servant in Gwen, Arthur's love, and the loyalty of many around her. The next season, Morgana descends further from the bounds of storytelling sense by becoming a bog witch, and abandoning both hygiene and good sense. Her bog witch era is the worst yet. She looks like she's sleeping in a cave of moss-covered bats and borrowing her wardrobe from Gandalf the Blech. Morgana essentially never evolves. She just arrives fully formed in a new state, and we're expected to get on board with it.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it. Get on with it.
Her character development essentially consists of hitting the audience in the face with a cast iron pan. Morgana really didn't have to be like this, which is the frustrating part. In the legends, she's often a student of Merlin, and they have kind of an unrequited lust thing going on where he wants her and she's not into it. Having Morgana become the morally gray magician she was meant to be would have been so interesting, instead of just making her an evil bog witch and then putting her down like Old Yeller.
No mortal blade can cure me.
This is no mortal blade.
There's also just no reason why Gaius shouldn't mentor Morgana like he does for Merlin. Even though Merlin has a grand destiny, Morgana's isn't written in stone, and with love and support she could have easily turned away from the bog and become an upstanding member of society. It does not escape my notice that the two characters who got the most thoroughly fucked by the narrative are the only two women who really get to make an impact in the story. That is not very girl boss of you. Mordred in the show is also a complete letdown. And most fans do agree on this point. Mordred of the legends is Arthur's illegitimate son, and is the source of his downfall and death. His betrayal heralds the fall of Camelot, and in the show, it's over a girl. Yep, because he liked a girl and Arthur wouldn't spare her. This is the great end of Camelot. This is the cause of Arthur's great fall, a teenage boy's crush. How deep and meaningful. Kara, the druid Arthur sentenced to death, is actually kind of symbolic of the issues with the final seasons. Arthur is supposed to be a merciful, wise king, better than his father, but he makes many of the same mistakes Uther did. Arthur knows his father's persecution of the Druids was wrong, but he just keeps doing it because they're just enemies now. And blood feud's got a blood feud, I guess. This brings up another issue with the narrative, which had to come up sooner or later. While the lore of magic... Doesn't have to get done today. While the lore of magic in this world is great, the way it's handled is kind of a disaster. I will say that my favorite character in the whole show is probably old Merlin. He is always a great time. But the problem we see as the show goes on is that Merlin's secret is increasingly pointless. By the final season, he has been by Arthur's side for 10 years. He has been a loyal servant, friend, co-conspirator, and confidant. It might have taken some doing, but Merlin could have helped Arthur overcome his aversion to magic and his anger towards it, especially if he'd revealed all the ways that magic has been used to help him or save him over the years. One of the most devastating parts of the revelation of Merlin's magic in the final episode is that Merlin has deceived his closest companion, and if Merlin had just come clean earlier, this would not have been a problem. There's a compelling reason for Merlin to keep a secret early on in the show. Uther would absolutely have had him killed. However, once Arthur is king and has unfettered power, there's no reason for Merlin to continue to hide his nature. He knows he's destined to protect and aid Arthur, and he has proof that he's done so for many years. While his culpability in Uther's death is both regrettable and undeniable, that doesn't negate the hundreds of times that Merlin has saved Arthur's sorry ass, all while juggling 2 jobs. Also, Arthur fundamentally understands that magic is neither good nor evil, but defined by its practitioner. It might make more sense if he hated magic because he blamed it for his father's death and for losing Morgana, but ultimately Arthur was aware of his father's flaws and the enemies he had made. Magic being initially banned in the kingdom also makes a lot of sense. Merlin, besides being untrained, is seriously overpowered. If he just got free reign from the beginning, the story would be a lot less interesting. and he would be a lot less relatable. His station and the constraints of the world keep him humble and relatable, but after a while, it's just ridiculous that magic remains verboten. One of the reasons that the character development doesn't work as well as the writers hope it will is that the passage of time is just totally fucked. We do get some passing references to when things happen, like Morgana's been missing for a year. But other than that, it's difficult to know when anything is supposed to have happened. Not only is the passage of time difficult to ascertain, but the pacing of the show is also total garbage. The golden age of Camelot is only supposed to be a few years that we don't get to see, and the first few seasons of the show are just Arthur chafing under Uther's thumb. Then, when Arthur is actually king, he's engaged in power struggles with his sister, who doesn't actually seem to want to be the queen, just longs for the abstract power of it all. We basically never get Arthur as king, nor do we get as many fun episodic adventures. Some of the best episodes are one-off silly ones that do nothing for the overall plot. Basically, a lot of time is wasted taking and retaking Camelot that could have been spent on literally anything more interesting. I'm not interested in hearing Morgana seethe for the 30th time about how she is so underprivileged and oppressed as the unacknowledged daughter of the king. Another issue this bad pacing presents is that we don't really get a good look at the adventures of Merlin and Arthur when he's king. We essentially get a throwaway line about how great Arthur has been as king for the last 3 years. And that's it. Merlin is never afforded a higher position at court, nor do we get to see him given credit for his knowledge and accomplishment. Merlin has been growing, developing, and changing, but he never gets recognized, even by those closest to him. So one of the things I like about the changes they made to the source material to make it primetime viewing is the lighter tone this version takes. For example, in the original stories, Mordred is Arthur's love child with one of his half-sisters. Yep. It really is just necessary to make some changes to the stories to make it friendlier to a wider audience. I don't have a problem with that. My issue is that the tone they've used and the changes they've made have seriously altered the trajectory of the story, and they have not changed course. To put it in a less wordy way, they looked at the roadmap, decided to go a completely different way, and then somehow ended up at the same destination. The ending of Arthur's story is tragic, with the caveat that he is destined to be king and will return again. However, this ending comes about after a series of events, like Mordred's betrayal and Guinevere's adultery, that aren't reflected in the show in the same light. It would certainly be unfaithful to the stories for the show to have a happy ending, but there are a lot of things in the show that are unfaithful to the stories. For example, in the original stories, Arthur and Morgan Le Fay share a mother, not a father. And the very premise of the show, that Merlin is a young man in Uther's court, runs contrary to the tales. So the difference between the originals and the show are flexible in some ways, but not in others. Why? My guess is that it's because endings are hard, and the easy way out was not to come up with a new one, despite the changes they've already made. The thing is that the ending with Arthur's tragic dad leaving the kingdom bereaved isn't terrible, but it's the way they did it that made the ending so bad. The ending is bleak, with Guinevere mourning the death of her husband as she assumes the throne, and no indication that Merlin will return to his friends in Camelot. Then, smash cut from her face to... It's not so much what's here as what's missing. Essentially, we see Merlin old walking across a road in modern England. I'm not gonna lie to you, that's pretty goddamn depressing. I think they were going for something along the lines of how loyal Merlin is to Arthur, but this wasn't necessary to reach that. There were a million potential endings, any one of which would have accurately conveyed Merlin's loyalty to Arthur and his awaiting of his return. Here are just a few. Merlin comes back with the news that Arthur is dead, but Merlin can tell Gwen is pregnant, so the line will continue. There's a somber moment when Gwen is declared queen, and Merlin's presence assured us that he'll be waiting. We could even get a series of different hands wearing Arthur's signet ring over time, panning over the round table with new faces, and Merlin always there. The problem with the ending isn't that Arthur dies, it's that he dies young, and that the ending is hopeless. The show is hopeful and optimistic by nature, and to end on such a downer made the audience sad. The ending could have been bittersweet, but instead the only descriptor for it is just bleak.
The reason fans loved this show was because it was funny and sweet, and the characters had excellent relationships. Many were fans of the Merlin/Arthur pairing because the actors had such great chemistry. There are just a lot of people doing a very good job involved in Merlin. Ultimately, as with many shows, the ending was disappointing. It's certainly a smaller fandom than Game of Thrones, for example, which had a finale that has been memed to death in its badness.
Best season ever!
I don't think that fans had an unrealistic expectation of the ending. It's just that fans expected something very different from what they received. I think that a lot of TV is bad these days in the name of subverting expectations, but this show stuck to the source material and still did poorly. I think ultimately, because the show left so much open to interpretation, fans can just substitute their canon for the events directly following the climax of the story. Still, it is very painful to get so invested in a story and have it end so unceremoniously. Kind of like this.
Hurt me?